Rebecca is Professor in the Bristol Digital Futures Institute and the School of Sociology, Politics and International Studies at the University of Bristol. And I think it's fair to say that the Bristol Digital Futures Institute, we were just chatting, that does kind of community activism and works in partnership with community organisation in kind of the same way that IGP does in the Protocol Labs, etc. So that might be something that we can talk about after the talk as well. And Rebecca's research crosses sociology, media and cultural studies and feminist theory, and she has particular interest in the everyday life of media, temporality, futures and presents, bodies, affect and new materialism, and inventive methodologies. She is the author of 3 monographs, and she's not put this in her bio, but one of those monographs is called Glitter. What's the subtitle? It's Social Politics and...
The Future Politics of the Ubiquitous Thing. Yeah.
The Future Politics of the Ubiquitous Thing. Yeah. So bearing in mind that this series is about how popular culture can be highly political and help us rethink ideas of prosperity, I think Rebecca's book on glitter, and it's a really good read, there's not much to talk about today, but it's a really good read, that shows you how you can take something that looks trivial and really read a lot of politics into it and get a lot of activism out of it. And she's written loads of journal articles, 4 journal special issues, and she today is going to talk about post-pandemic hybrid experiments as collaborative creative methods for making prosperous futures. So welcome, Rebecca.
Okay, so today I'm going to talk about a project I've recently done with a community organisation called Knowle West Media Centre, based in South Bristol. So as Kate was saying about the way that you work here with different community organisations, this is kind of central to the work I've recently been doing. And this is a digital arts organisation that aims to create thriving neighbourhoods through arts, tech and care. And it is really a collaborative project, as you'll see as I go on. So I'm here kind of representing the Knowle West Media Centre staff I work with on the project, especially Martha King, Ella Chedburn and Josie Gayasi, but also lots of other people from the organisation were involved and the Knowle West community as well. It's the first time I've presented on the project, so I'm trying out some new ideas and kind of ways of understanding what we've done. So, you know, I'm happy for questions and discussion kind of later on. But in this paper, what I'm going to do is focus on the project in terms of examining how collaborative creative methods might help us make more inclusive, accessible and enjoyable digital futures. So my focus on these kinds of inclusive, accessible, enjoyable digital futures can, I think, be framed in terms of what I understand you to be doing here in the Institute for Global Prosperity, and what you're kind of interested in. So seeing prosperity beyond the economic, thinking about how it's underpinned by justice and a kind of fairness, and is created through kind of collaboration as well. So my work doesn't specifically focus on prosperity, but I think it is interesting to think about it today as we enter into post-pandemic worlds. And we use the term post with kind of scare quotes because we're aware that the pandemic continues in various and uneven ways. So we don't try to mean that the pandemic is over, but more that we're in a time in between the days of strict restrictions and this kind of return to normal. So the pandemic kind of both reinforced many social inequalities and it produced ideas and practices for how we might do things differently. And I thought I'd start with a much shared article that the novelist Arundhati Roy wrote for the Financial Times, and this was on the 2nd of April 2020, and she kind of was exploring the build-up and the immediate aftermath of lockdown in India on the 24th of March 2020. So this was written and published a few days afterwards. And she says, whatever it is, the coronavirus has made the mighty kneel and brought the world to a halt like nothing else could. Our minds are still racing back and forth, longing for a return to normality, trying to stitch our future to our past and refusing to acknowledge the rupture. But the rupture exists, and in the midst of this terrible despair, it offers us a chance to rethink the doomsday machine we have built for ourselves. And, you know, she says here that nothing could be worse than a return to normality. So she talks about how the pandemics historically have forced humans to break with the past and imagine their worlds anew, and that this one is no different. It's a portal or a gateway between one world and the next. We can choose to walk through it, dragging our kind of existing prejudice and hatred with us, or we can walk through lightly with little luggage, ready to imagine another world and ready to fight for it. So we obviously know a lot more about the pandemic globally than we did when this was written, and the world is no longer halted as it was with the various lockdowns. But I kind of just want to hang on to its central idea that nothing can be worse than a return to normality, and that the pandemic kind of presents itself as this rupture or portal via which we can imagine our world anew. And I know that there's kind of lots of politics associated with that, and you know, maybe that's something we can kind of talk about later on. So I'm not kind of trying to kind of smooth over, obviously, all the kind of the death and the kind of other sorts of inequalities that arose as a consequence of the pandemic. But you know, how might we then think of this as this kind of rupture? It also sounds quite grand and abstract and perhaps a bit overwhelming, so what I want to do is focus it down in the first instance on how we might create different digital futures, and then in the second instance on the post-pandemic hybrid futures project more specifically. So one of the ways in which the pandemic both reinforced and altered existing social inequalities was through digital technology. So if we take Britain as an example, for many people the pandemic involved a rapid and a large-scale shift from in-person to digital encounters across work, education, medicine, and health, shopping and socialising. Some people found this pivot to digital technologies and experiences inaccessible, cumbersome, overwhelming, draining, either because they did not have access to digital devices or kind of Wi-Fi, weren't proficient in how to use them, or because they did not care to do everything virtually. Others reported they increased or improved accessibility and inclusiveness. So for those with disabilities, caring responsibilities, or with certain kinds of financial restrictions, doing things from home meant that they were more likely to be able to attend some things. And other people kind of reported that online functions such as chat and turning cameras off meant that they could participate in ways that could suit them. And I'm kind of thinking here a bit of my experience of online teaching during that time, where actually the chat function became a way in which lots of people who didn't usually talk in seminars were kind of participating in this different way. And of course, still others were not doing things online. The newly configured front line, as it was called here, included emergency workers and teachers, and also warehouse workers, delivery drivers, supermarket staff, who kept things going for those of us or those people who were able to lock down at home. So what this brief and kind of incomplete sketch suggests then is a complicated and uneven picture where some benefit from the affordances of digital technologies and others don't. So it's in this kind of context that we were shaping and thinking about our collaborative project. So here I'm kind of interested in how these collaborative and creative methods between community members, community organisations and academic researchers might approach and understand such situations and might imagine and make different worlds. So a lot of what I'm going to talk about is part of what Knowle West Media Centre do and have been doing for many years in terms of the work with the local community in which it's based. So before this, I just went to an exhibition that's at Raven Row, just by Liverpool Street, which is called People Make Television, and it's this amazing archive of programmes that the BBC broadcast in the 70s that were made by a whole range of different people, and I walked in there and there's an exhibit by Noel West Television. So this organisation that I'm working with now has this really long history of these participatory methods of kind of teaching people, giving tech to people in the community, kind of courses in how to use it, and then thinking about what the community might like to do with that. And, you know, there are also lots of issues around the community, and I'm not trying to kind of sugarcoat those as well, and perhaps that's something we can talk about later on. But Noel West is this area of South Bristol, and a previous BDFI and Noel West Media Centre collaboration conducted during the pandemic, and it indicated that it was very unequal in terms of access to Wi-Fi and the digital devices that were required for people to do like online schooling, for example, but also kind of access to health and kind of socialising. What we did in our project is we focused our collaboration on hybrid experiences. And by this we mean the mixture of digital and physical spaces through which people can connect and come together. So as the lockdowns lifted and the governments dropped pandemic measures, hybrid spaces which brought together in-person and online elements became increasingly common. So again, we were trying to think about this in-between time as this moment to reflect on, you know, what we liked about hybrid, what worked, what didn't, and how we might shape hybrid futures. So the project builds on a number of hybrid tools and methods that Noel West Media Centre developed with communities in 2020 and 2021, so before I was working with them, which included hybrid workshops, live broadcasts of community events and festivals, and posting packs of activity packs to people, so they could do them in their own time, or perhaps kind of come together online and do them. In particular, in 2021, they ran this programme of events called Come Together, which explored how we could connect through a mix of digital and physical spaces, and they produced resources, tips and pointers for those interested in organising accessible, sensory and enjoyable hybrid spaces. And these kind of were really wide-ranging. So one activity involved people coming together online to drink a cup of tea, listening to an audio recording. Another worked with young people, thinking about introverted and non-verbal communication and the ways in which hybrid and online technologies might facilitate that. Thinking about being in a Zoom call, for example, muting videos off or kind of using the chat function. They also held a remote access party, a virtual party where people came together to dance, enjoy performances and connect with other people. So they were really kind of trying to think about issues of inclusion, accessibility, enjoyment, reclaiming rest as this kind of political act or form of activism that I'll kind of come back to that later on. So these are just a few examples of the programme, and we kind of built on this in our project. So we were really exploring here what we've learned from spending so much time online as producers, audiences and facilitators of digital technologies, asking about our experiences of hybrid spaces and what we'd like to keep on doing, and at the same time what we never want to do again. So kind of not assuming that we have to kind of go on in the way that we have been. Really central was this kind of last question there about how we can ensure that questions of accessibility and inclusion raised by doing things online are not lost in a rush to return to in-person ways of doing things. So how might we kind of think about those people who said that they preferred, for lots of different reasons, doing things online? Like, how do we not lose those kinds of political and ethical questions? So the project had 4 main stages, and I'm going to go through them just to give you a sense before then coming back to think about how we might understand the project in terms of kind of this making of different digital futures. In the first stage, which we called reflecting and reviewing, we took stock of the Come Together programme and the other Knoll West Media Centre hybrid projects that they've been doing during the pandemic, but also before that, focusing on what we'd learnt as organisers and audiences, and on feedback from participants. So I said there's this really amazing resource. If you're interested in doing a kind of hybrid experience, this is a really amazing resource of kind of questions and practical kind of points to look at. So we revisited that, but we also conducted short interviews with Knoll West Media Centre staff. So we gave them questions and they recorded their answers briefly for us as voice notes, and members of the local community as well, on what they'd learnt, what they liked, disliked, and what they wanted to kind of continue doing. And what really emerged in this phase of the research is that there was this kind of explicit acknowledgement and valuing of Knoll West Media Centre staff of the need for hybrid futures to be designed with ethical and political questions of inclusion and diversity in mind. So some of the hopes and wishes that they talked about included that those that are harder to reach are not left behind, that accessibility and inclusion are embedded into how we design activities. So, for example, disabled and neurodivergent people who benefited from online initiatives weren't forgotten. So I think kind of one of the things that this kind of pointed to is how digital technologies that enable hybrid experiences, they're not neutral. They do things and they're involved in creating inclusions and exclusions, and they're not inevitable. So, and I'll talk about this a bit later on, but we started to kind of think about, well, what might a hybrid experience be? Does it have to be live? Does it have to be digital? You know, how far might we stretch these experiences without kind of losing, this sense of kind of coming together? We wanted to base our hybrid experiments in the community. So during this stage, we identified a local festival, an annual festival, Knoll West Festival, as a place to kind of try out different hybrid activities. So every year, different community organisations based in the area take the lead in hosting and organising, and the festivals typically include live music, food and craft stalls, and different activities. So in the one that in 2022 there was macrame making, there was cooking, there was kind of a collaging session. And it took place at Filton Community Centre, which is a short walk away from where Knoll West Media Centre are based. So this is where we thought, okay, we're going to try out some hybrid activities. What we did then in stage 2 is this kind of co-design workshop where we worked together to collectively imagine a hybrid future and come up with practical ideas that we could do at the Knoll West Festival. We explored different methods of imagining what hybrid activities might be. So we did a method where we free wrote on what hybrid meant to us. So for 3 minutes, we each just kind of free wrote whatever came into our mind about what hybrid meant to us, and then we shared that. We also did this user mapping experience of the festival with a different persona. So we worked with these different personas that are up there in pairs, and we tried to map out what if we were a mum in her mid-30s with 2 children, like what might her wants, needs and barriers be for the for coming to the festival, and what might what hybrid elements might be most valuable and most fun. So we collectively kind of came up with hybrid activities based on this persona mapping, including what we would do if resources, so money was no object, if staff or technology or space were no issue. So, you know, if ideally, what would we be able to do? And then we then, and that's what that picture is there, we then kind of organised them into things that were, you know, imaginative and exciting, but we weren't able to do. So we kind of narrowed down a set of activities that we could do. So we came up with a list of hybrid activities to try out before, during and after the festival. And we're thinking about the best platforms, digital platforms, or whether they had to be digital for them to kind of take place on. And, you know, for Noel West, what they kind of said that this way of thinking about hybrid activities not only is taking place within the festival, but as before and after, they found this kind of quite novel, and again kind of was leading to kind of stretching what we might understand hybrid to be. So before, in the next stage was this kind of experimenting and testing phase during at the festival, before, during and after the festival. So before the festival, and really a lot based on the persona mapping kind of exercise, we produced these videos that tried to give people a sense of what the festival was going to be like before they arrived, and addressing some really mundane things like where you might park, or whether you could park, what bus stops to get off at, whether there would be chairs to sit on at the festival, whether there would be quiet spaces there, what you might do with young kids or kind of older kids. And these performed for Noel West really well. They were shared on local Facebook pages, which tended to be where the Noel West community had kind of most engagement. So they were shared there. They performed really well for kind of Noel West videos, and they were really happy with them. We thought kind of quite carefully about how we would film them. This also involved Noel West staff trying out different equipment that they hadn't used before, so it was kind of an opportunity again for them to try out and experiment with different things. They were hosted by Claudia Collins, who you can just see her glasses there. She's from the area, lives in the area, is very well connected, so it has this kind of friendly and accessible, and also kind of quite a rough and ready tone. We wanted it to feel like kind of welcoming, as well as being kind of informative. So those were some of the things that we did before the festival, and they, you know, that kind of accompanied more general promotion of on posters or on Facebook and Instagram as well. So during the festival, there were three primary hybrid elements that we experimented with. So we held 2 live streams, one on Facebook at the beginning of the festival, and one a bit later on Zoom. And we were thinking of those as ways to kind of share the festival with those people who weren't able to be there, but also the Facebook one, which we did at the start, we were thinking, well, maybe if you're wondering about whether to come and you see this, that will kind of encourage you to come. None of us had done kind of live streams before, so it was kind of an experiment in that way. Yeah, we got, I think they went quite well. I'll come back and talk a bit more about some of them, or the Zoom one in particular, a bit later on. But during these live streams, we also asked people if there were things that they'd really wanted to do at the festival that they weren't able to do, and we sent packs out to people who said, so there was one person, for example, who said, I really wanted to come to the collaging workshop, I'm not well today, and so we got her address and we sent her a collaging pack. So again, thinking about, you know, hybrid, she wasn't doing that live during the festival, and that was something for her to do in her own time. It wasn't digital, but we were kind of thinking of this as a kind of a stretching of what hybrid might be. So that was, they were the main kind of digital elements of the hybrid activities that we did. But we also did the two other things. So one is that we made these postcards of Noel West, and we left these around the festival for people to send to people, friends and family who weren't able to be at the festival in person. And we had a post box, that's a post box, that's a real post box, but we had a post box within the festival where people could kind of post their postcards. They turned out to be really popular with children, writing to grandparents especially. these little postcards. So again, not a digital element, but maybe this could be a hybrid thing, and it's about bringing people together virtually across these different spaces. We also put together a playlist, and this is on the Noel West Media Centre YouTube page. So there was a lineup across the whole festival of local bands and local acts, and so where possible, we put together this playlist of people, and this still is there. So again, you know, it was there for the festival. We used it in some of the live streams, but it still exists. So, you know, what do we mean by hybrid? It's kind of, it's not live. It's still there. It's still accessible, and people are still accessing it now. So after the festival, we shared on various Facebook pages photographs of the event. There was an edited film of the festival. Like I said, we sent these personalised at-home packs to people who attended the live stream, on Zoom, and various elements kind of still kind of remain there. So there was a kind of an attempt for us to kind of follow up, and not just, you know, the festival's over, but what might we do afterwards as well. And then the last stage was this kind of evaluating and sharing stage. So we've been kind of reflecting on what we've learned, and we've co-written a report that's just been published this week. But we're also kind of hoping to kind of build on this. This was a very small pilot project, so we're hoping to kind of build this into something kind of longer term. Okay, so that gives you a sense of what we did. But I want now to talk a bit more about how we might think about the project in terms of these collaborative and creative methods, and what these might do to shape and make different digital futures. So far I've been describing our projects in terms of hybrid experiments, and I want to kind of say that here experiments refers to something quite specific, and this might or might not be what you understand experiments to be. But Britta Tim Knudsen, Mads Kroll and Carsten Sage talk about experiments in these ways. So in that first quotation there, they talk about how experiments, due to their ability to produce sensuous events, enable more or less intense shifts in attention and involve participants in orchestrated yet unpredictable processes that activate the body's ability to relate to, sense and imagine the world in new ways. So there's quite a lot in that quote, but for now let's focus on how experiments are orchestrated yet unpredictable processes in which the world may be imagined in new ways. So I want to kind of suggest that they are inherently future-oriented, and that they are about kind of world making. They're about making the world in particular ways. So that second quotation there, they talk about how affective experimentation is a practice which is at once inherently unpredictable, vested with the ability to open up new but not necessarily progressive futures, but which may also give otherwise hidden or invisible social logics a visceral form. So in these senses, the post-pandemic hybrid futures project can be understood as a mode of experimentation that seeks to open up new futures, giving questions of inclusion, accessibility and enjoyment, which are often hidden or invisible, this kind of visceral form. They are planned or orchestrated. We did a lot of planning around what we were going to do, but at the same time they are unpredictable, they're open-ended or they're speculative. We're not quite sure what they might do or even whether they will work. And some of ours didn't work, but even if they fail or kind of partly fail, that tells us something. That's kind of can be interesting in itself. So I'm going to outline 3 ways in which I think the project can be understood in terms of these kinds of definitions of experimentation. So first, and this kind of connects and overlaps with the next 2 points, we were experimenting with what hybrid means now and might mean in the future. So we were trying out different senses of hybrid, probing what it could and couldn't encompass. So if hybrid is this mixture of online and offline spaces, how far might we push this? If we centre experience, how might we experiment with kind of hybrid and hybrid activities? So hybrid, in the sense that we understood it then, doesn't necessarily mean high-tech equipment, or that it necessarily requires a great deal of technical expertise, although some people did have, you know, a lot of technical expertise in the team. But it doesn't have to do that, and I'll come back to this in a minute. But if we think about the postcards, they're not a digital technology, but we use them to connect two different spaces, the festival and the space of the people who would receive them. They were about giving people who weren't there a sense of or a connection to the festival experience, connecting them to it virtually through the materiality of the postcard. The other aspects of the project also functioned as experiments, as we weren't sure what they would produce. So trying hybrid things out before the festival, like I said, was something that Knowle West Media Centre hadn't done before, but was kind of made visible through the co-design workshops. We also didn't know how the live streams would go, and we were quite nervous about them. We learned that they stretched hybrid in a different way. In that the Facebook one, we didn't think about this beforehand, but the Facebook one remains archived on the Facebook page. We didn't untick the box to say don't do that. And we had more engagement with it after we'd finished live streaming. So we had more comments after we'd finished live streaming from people asking us, oh, when is the festival? What did you do? And, you know, and we kind of hadn't prepared for that. So it wasn't kind of live in the sense that it was happening only while we were filming and kind of streaming it. So in those two senses then, hybrid doesn't necessarily mean live or synchronous, and it doesn't necessarily always have to mean that it encompasses digital elements or that it's digital kind of only. But we also learned that we didn't probably frame the Zoom live stream in the right way, so we described it as this kind of cosy portal into the festival. But actually the experience probably wasn't very cosy, and lots of people told us that Zoom was off-putting as it reminded them of work, being at work, and of the pandemic. So, you know, again, kind of thinking about the ways in which digital platforms work differently, they have different associations, and we need to think carefully about which are right for the audiences and the participants we want to engage. So there was quite a lot of buffering with our live streams, and on the Facebook one that seemed kind of fine. We weren't really worried about that because it was quite like rough and ready, quite accessible, but we got quite anxious about that during the live stream that we were doing with the Zoom, because I think we were more kind of accustomed to Zoom being part of our work lives, and that it needed to be kind of neat and kind of seamless. So the second point I want to make is that we really tried to centre these questions of inclusion, accessibility and the sensory. So from the research questions that we came up with to the methods we used to explore Knowle West Media Centre's staff's experiences of hybrid activities, to the ways that we designed them and tried them out. So the project was designed according to theories, principles and methodologies informed by lots of different critical approaches, and these are already there in kind of what Knowle West Media Centre are doing. So it's not me kind of coming and saying, thinking about this. It was really collaborative in that these were the sorts of practices and principles they were already working with. So principles from feminism, queer approaches, CRIP or disability focused, and decolonial practices. So one of the things we tried to do was avoid common sense assumptions about online technologies producing distracted consumers of media who can't concentrate or make connections with other people. And there's a really excellent book by Susanna Parsonen on this that talks about how social media and digital media are much more ambivalent and kind of ambiguous. So instead, in the live streams, for example, we wanted to use them to explore how they might give people a sense of the festival that they weren't able to attend. And through the co-design workshop, we also tried to imagine hybrid without limits and then to kind of filter these down into more achievable activities. So throughout them, we were informed by disability communities and crit politics, thinking about who may be excluded from in-person events. Like I said, this built on work that was central to Noel West's programme already, like the Come Together programme. And we were thinking especially about the initiatives around reclaiming rest. So making space for drinking tea, spending time in local nature, sleeping. And this is also shaped by feminist, anti-racist, decolonial, queer and crit work. So Tricia Hersey, for example, describes rest as resistance and talks about how a commitment to rest as a form of resistance came from my everyday experiences of being part of the machine-level pace of our culture and surviving the trauma of the terror of poverty, exhaustion, white supremacy and capitalism. So why we framed the Zoom live stream as a cosy portal was kind of trying to kind of think with those ideas of rest, and that people could participate in ways where they didn't have to be there in person. They might be lying down at home, but they might still have this sense of connection. So this idea of rest as resistance is a way of undoing grind culture, which impacts especially on people of colour and other minoritised people. And Adrienne Marie Brown draws on black feminism and centres the experience of black women to propose what she calls pleasure activism. So we were also trying to think with these ideas of, like, what if activism was pleasurable? What might be possible if we were all living our full pleasure potential? What would happen if we aligned with a pleasure politic, especially as people who are surviving long-term oppressive conditions? So these seemed kind of appealing to us, especially thinking about kind of this moment post-pandemic. What's also important about these approaches are that they understand inclusion and accessibility not as ways of adding people into pre-existing systems. These versions of inclusion, like these additive versions of inclusion and accessibility, have long been criticised for upholding systems that are unequal and oppressive. So rather they are about creating alternative systems organised around the lives, needs and wants of people who are usually excluded from mainstream ways of doing things. And discussing technology and design, Sasha Constanza-Chock argues for design justice, to actively dismantle rather than unintentionally reinforce the matrix of domination through a growing community of practice, of design practice that aims to ensure a more equitable distribution of design's benefits and burdens, meaningful participation in design decisions, and recognition of community-based, indigenous and diasporic design traditions, knowledge and practices. So, you know, this is specifically focused on design, but we were using methods of from design, these kinds of collaborative designs, and trying to kind of centre these ideas of justice, which is not to say that we succeeded or that these aims and values are easy or straightforward to design and put into practice. So if we think about the co-design workshop, for example, there were Noel West Media Centre staff participating in that who held different roles within the organisation. They worked on arts programmes, communications, operations, and from this, we were of different ages as well, quite a mix of ages, and we were able to generate a wide range of knowledge and expertise of what Noel West Media Centre had done and what it could do, as well as these kind of practical perspectives on what would and wouldn't work. And the method of the imagining a persona's wants, needs and barriers worked well in some ways for those of us in the room. So I was working with someone to try to imagine what it might be like for an 18-year-old boy from the local area to come to the festival with his friends. What would they want to do? What would they need at the festival? What would be the barriers to coming and to staying and having a good time? And we came up with quite a substantial list. Although we were also questioning whether this persona would want to come to the festival in the first place. Like, is it for them anyway? But it's not without its issues. So one of the kind of calls for design justice is to replace the figure of the universal user. So we were trying to do this by thinking carefully through these personas, but it also involved us making assumptions about our personas. So I don't live in South Bristol, and at the time of the workshop I didn't live in Bristol at all. I'm not 18, obviously. I do not identify as a man, and so then there were these questions about how far I can speculate on the wants, needs and barriers of this persona. So this method was a kind of starting point, but in a larger and longer research project, it could and should be developed further to more fully engage with these kinds of principles here. So in other words, the method both elicited some important and interesting insights, but it's not a stand-in for working with people who live with the experiences that we were trying to imagine. So we weren't, it wasn't an unproblematic project in any sense. Okay, so the third point I wanted to kind of raise, and I think that's of direct relevance to the theme of this seminar series, is that the project utilises everyday free or easily available technologies and practices, Zoom, Facebook, YouTube, all the way to kind of postcards. These are all technologies and practices that are firmly part of everyday life. And this is important because it sees the experimentation that I was talking about earlier as embedded within ordinary and popular culture, right? So experimentation, it doesn't, we can experiment with what we've already got, right? It doesn't have to be anything kind of separate from what we're already doing. So I'm drawing here on a long tradition of cultural studies on culture as ordinary, so from Raymond Williams, and popular culture, as in Stuart Hall's terms in 1981, as a site where a struggle for and against a culture of the powerful is engaged. It's also the stake to be won or lost in that struggle. So popular culture as this arena of consent and resistance. So if digital technologies are becoming more and more embedded in everyday life, whether or not we like them or want them to be, they are part of contemporary popular culture. And, thinking back to those kinds of digital inequalities that I was talking about, if popular culture is a site of struggle, then digital technologies are and can be involved in that kind of contestation around power. So I've already talked a lot about how I think the collaborative and creative methods that we deploy in our project centre these questions of inclusion, accessibility and enjoyment. And in this way, they help to show how the kinds of hybrid experiments we did might ensure that we do not return to normal, but instead through the kinds of design justice that Constanza Chock is pointing to, they shift to other ways of organising cultural life. So we don't want to make too grand a claim for the project, and that's not what I'm trying to do here. It is a pilot project, it's not perfect. I don't kind of want to generalise from it, but we might see it as a way of trying out possible visions or even producing a merely prospective sense of openness. So in this way, the project, we're kind of trying to understand the project as a way of asking questions, imagining that things might be different. Indeed, that the project is not large or grand might be considered a strength as well as a weakness, for it is not only macro processes that change the world, but also minor ones, such as these everyday, ordinary, popular, such as those that everyday, ordinary, popular culture encompass and can engender. So experiments, as I frame them here, can function as catalysts or media of change and or as vehicles to sense and feel the world's capacity to move and be moved. So they work as processes rather than endpoints. There you go. So here, this design justice point about viewing change as emergent from an accountable, accessible and collaborative process rather than as a point at the end of a process. So they're not end points, but they're processes that help us to think about how things might be otherwise. So to return to where I began then, and this is where I'm going to finish, with the pandemic and the making and remaking of inequalities, what I'm suggesting is that we might understand digital technologies as part of popular culture that might resist and change such inequalities, and that digital technologies might operate in terms of the portal that Roy describes and help us resist a return to normality and instead help us to imagine our world anew. So these new kinds of hybrid and digital futures.